We live in a world in which we are certain that what's most important is what we've got to say. And that is just, we're just waiting for the chance to say what we've got to say. And, we read books on how to put it so it'll be more persuasive. And we're pretty much working on and fixated on what we've got to say. But the fact of the matter is that the power in communication isn't in what we've got to say. It's in listening to what you've got to say. So if I can, first of all, notice that when I listen to you, the way I listen, that you could say my listening is a filled up vessel. It's filled up with what I think and what I hope and what I fear and what I want. So if I want to get past what you call talking past each other, then I've got to stop for a moment and notice the way I'm listening and notice that it's filled up. And then if I do notice that, and when I say notice it, noticing it is different from knowing it. Everybody pretty much knows that they have prejudices and biases, but knowing it is very different than catching yourself in the act of listening, so to speak. Like noticing as you're conversing that, oh, wow, I'm not really getting what this person is saying, and not finding that out afterwards, or noticing I'm being a little defensive here, but noticing it as it's happening where you have a choice, because you don't have any choice if you're not aware it's happening. And if you do notice that your listening is filled up, or you're being a little defensive, or you're somehow preparing what you're going to say in response rather than getting what that person's got to say, you have the chance to stop the action and just let it go. And then your job is to actually get fully and completely what the other person's got to say, including the experience that is underneath what they're saying and the commitment that's underneath what they're saying, and get that so fully that the other person experiences that what they wanted to say lives over with you. Now, that doesn't mean I agree with it. It doesn't mean that I've assented to anything. It means that I've granted it validity. And if I can do that, then I have a chance at a real conversation. The first thing to do when you're skeptical, I think, is be skeptical. There's nothing wrong with skepticism. When we're leading the communication program for Landmark, we invite skepticism because it's authentic and it's real, and we have every reason to be skeptical. We live in a world where virtually no one ever hears us. And for the most part, if you order a chicken salad sandwich, you're just as apt to get tuna salad. So I think skepticism is warranted, valuable, and useful. And everybody I've ever met has had some experiences of what I'm going to call really being in communication. And I'm talking about those rare moments when you almost don't need words. And you have this experience that there's just no separation between you and another human being. Everybody's had that experience from time to time, usually very rarely. But we don't ever conclude that, well, if that can happen, there must be some way to make that experience more available, and critically, more available when I'm disagreeing with someone or when the stakes are high. That kind of sense of real appreciation of one another inside of which we disagree. It's as if there's a background to every conversation, and nobody's paying attention to the background. But if the background is genuine respect, authentic, not feigned respect, but real respect, real concern and care for the other person and for what they've got to say, then that background can abide disagreement, even strong disagreement. That background is one in which conflicts can get resolved. But what happens very normally is that if I disagree with you, I start to be more distant from you. I start to be more separate from you. And as if I am nothing more than my point of view and you're nothing more than your point of view. And we kind of forget we're human beings and there's a lot we share, probably a lot more that we share than we don't share. It's the capacity, in my view, to create that background and maintain it during any conversation that makes the real difference, rather than what's in the foreground, which is what I say and what you say. I'm quite certain from my own personal experience and being with thousands and thousands of people that it's the background of the conversation that really determines what can get said, what can't get said, and determines how it's going to wind up. My wife and I were visiting some friends, uh, and they, much to my surprise, are for a different presidential candidate than I am. And I was a little taken aback because I, of course, think the person I'm for, everybody should be for. And and the husband of this in this couple was really quite adamant and very and spoke in a way that was pretty disparaging, both of the candidate that I support and of me for supporting this candidate, as if I had been duped and if I'm, stupidly naive and things like that. And I know that before I participated in these programs, I'm quite sure I would have reacted. Uh, but at this point, people talking is just people talking. It doesn't have much bite for me. It doesn't have, people can pretty much say anything. That may sound arrogant to say, but it really's been road tested. and, and the more I really got what he said, at first he elevated the intensity, because he wanted a reaction. He wanted, and it wasn't that I was denying reacting. There just wasn't any reaction other than to be interested. It's interesting. Here's this person I know to be very intelligent. I know to be a caring human being. I know that about him. And he was behaving in a way that, for me, was inconsistent with that, which was interesting. Whatever would have this quite outstanding person, I think, behave in that way. And so I found that the way I was just naturally listening to him was interested, and there wasn't a shred of disapproval or disagree. He knows I disagree. I didn't have to do anything. And the more I got what he said, and the more I made it my business to put myself in his shoes, really put myself in his shoes, so much so that I could argue his view of the matter. The more that happened, the more something kind of dissolved. It was interesting. It was as if we got closer while disagreeing instead of further apart while disagreeing. Closer as people. And he didn't change his vote, nor was I out to change his vote. I think that would have been a thankless task, maybe. But I'll tell you what did happen. Uh, our relationship got stronger in a circumstance in which it was virtually certain to fray. And it didn't. Not only did it not fray, it got closer. And at the end, he said, I've never been able to have a conversation like this that didn't wind up in a shouting match. And I really, really appreciate it. And I want to tell you some other things. And then he started to speak about what he felt had led him to the viewpoint he had, and some negative experiences he had had with migrants and people from other countries. And again, I heard the man, and I put myself in his shoes, and at the end of it, I don't know if he'd say this, but it was sure my experience that his, what's the word? His views were a little less concrete. There was a little give, a little fluidity, a little openness, and it was a satisfying conversation instead of an uncomfortable, awkward, I can't wait till this to get out of here kind of conversation. You have to determine, I think, what's most important to you. What do you want to get out of this conversation? Is it your intention to change somebody's mind? Is it your intention to state your position? Or is it your intention to solidify a relationship? And the way you're going to be in the conversation is going to have a lot to do with what's most important to you. It isn't most important to me to have my views dominate. Now, I want my views to prevail in the election. I want my views to prevail in my community, but I know the only chance I've got to have my views prevail is a relatedness with my neighbors and fellow citizens here. That's the only, there's no other way. I think the views ought to carry the day because they're the right views. But the problem is the people with an opposite view think their views ought to carry the day because it's the right view. So that's never going to work out. I don't see any future for it. And it's been my business of late to get to know the people who live in my community, period, as a family member and as a citizen, as a person who is way more than their political views, and to connect as people. Now, if I'm having a conversation for that purpose, it establishes a certain kind of background. We could say a background of relationship. And in that background, I think it's possible to say anything to one another. Somebody you know cares about you, and you experience their respect for you. When they say something critical of your viewpoint, you have no problem with it. You're kind of interested. Why do they think that? Someone who you suspect thinks little of you or thinks ill of you says the exact same thing in the exact same tone of voice, and you and I close down because the background the conversation's being had in prevails over the content. And so I think what any of us can do is really say, what do we want out of this conversation? If what we want is to establish a relationship in which we can have a conversation, and we don't bother to have the conversation until that relationship's in place, we have a good chance of having it be successful, it seems to me. But if we don't do that, and we just try to have a difficult conversation that we know is going to be difficult in the normal background, which is I'm a thing over here in danger and threatened by outside forces, and you're the same, it's never going to go well. This may sound Pollyanna and very nice and not applicable. Here's the fact of the matter. Given the nature of the world we're in, we better damn well get good at conversing with people with opposite views successfully. No kidding. It's a real hardcore, to me, a really hardcore practical issue because if I look into the future of division and conflict that's getting more and more violent and more personal and more disruptive, there's going to be no area of life, not going to work, not going to the recreation center, not going to the gym, that's going to be comfortable and unthreatening. So for me, there's a real incentive to master communicating with people I disagree with as a practical matter, not as a nice thing, not as a let's sing kumbaya thing, but a damn imperative given the nature of how it's moving right now. And most of us most of the time have the experience of not being really gotten, of being misunderstood, having things we say used against us. I mean, there's a panoply of complaints people carry around about communication, and it includes complaints about communication in their own household. Well, okay. I don't think the future of carrying around those complaints and having them get hotter and hotter and hotter is one that is in any of our interests. And there's going to some people have got to take on an alternative, it seems to me. And I think that's a practical, serious matter, not a being nice, hold hands and sing kumbaya matter. Issues that are existential, where we think our view has got to prevail, is where it's most essential to get into real communication with people who don't share our view. The more important, the more at risk we are, the more life-threatening the thing we're talking about is, then the more important it is that I figure out how to actually have a conversation with you. Is for me, the higher the stakes, the greater the imperative to really be in communication. Because if I'm right and the thing my view is in fact about something existentially threatening, boy, I that ought to motivate me to listen better rather than to make you more and more wrong and to be more and more opposed to you, because the future of my making you more and more wrong and being more and more opposed to you is that this existential threat manifests. To me, we get the media we deserve. So, and we are polarized, and we have a polarized media, and it's very tough to get a handle on how things might look if I had a different upbringing or if I lived in a different part of the country or whatever. But I think the only answer to that is to get committed to some kind of break open in my own perceptions and just seek out alternative views and converse. To me, the answer to all of this is authentic communication. I don't see any hope for tomorrow morning finding a newspaper that's without any bias, or turning on a station and finding one without any bias. I think I'm going to live in this bubble until the paradigm shifts. Therefore, to me, the only solution is individuals communicating more effectively and creating a kind of groundswell of authenticity. And there are people out to do that.
Well,
We've become so accustomed to our communication not making a difference, and our communication and other people's communication not making a difference, that for the most part, we don't notice that our communication isn't working, that our communication isn't working. I think it's got to start there, because it's so easy to blame the media and your neighbors who have different views and some political figure. But if I could go, wait a second, I got something I want heard, I got something I want people to get behind, and I'm not communicating effectively, that'd be a hell of a good start, because I'd start to address how I'm communicating, which means how I'm listening and how I'm speaking, instead of my endless complaints about everyone and everything. And if I actually start with me and the way I listen and the way I speak, everybody I know who starts there has a chance at least moving the ball down the field. But if you start the victim of everything and everyone, I don't see any way to have anything happen except to become more of a victim. And no matter how much you blame other people or other things when your communication doesn't produce the results you want, or no matter how you explain that your communication isn't producing what you intend because of circumstances, or because of your imagined personal character flaws, no matter who you blame for your failures in communication, and no matter how you explain or justify them, if you're honest with yourself, you're going to have to acknowledge, it seems to me, at least to yourself, that our communication isn't working. Once you do that, it starts you in another direction, I think. And then you're interested in, well, wait a second, how am I listening? What goes on when I'm listening to another person, and especially someone I disagree with? I think once you look into that, you're going to produce some breakthroughs. And I think when you start to listen to yourself through the ears of the other person, you're apt to produce some breakthroughs that aren't available in a world of finger pointing. If I want to fix my car, I got to be able to lift the hood and see what's going on and see what could be going on, which means I got to have some distinctions of automobiles. You know, my kid went to mechanic school. He can open the hood, he knows exactly, and he can do. I look at it and it's just a bunch of wires and metal, and I have no damn idea. Similarly, so where do you, that for me is the big issue, is that what's missing is distinctions. Mostly I'm speaking to graduates, but when I can get them to get that, look, you did the forum, and a lot of things, you behave very differently in situations because the story is separate from what happened for you. And because you see that other people's reality is that a whole bunch of stuff, that the distinctions you got in the forum altered how life occurs, how you occur, how other people occur. You don't have anything like that in communication. You got nothing. You got either listening or not listening. But there's as many different ways to listen as there are different ways to move. And I think there's a thing I say that I think might work on a TikTok environment, which is, if I was going to give you $10 for every way of moving you could list, you'd have a pretty good list. You walking, skipping, jumping, dancing, crawling. You'd have a pretty damn good list. I'd spend a lot of money. But if I were to say to you, okay, now make a list of the various ways you can listen, you I would save my money, because you'd have listening and not listening for the most part. Well, what if there were as many ways to listen as there are to move? Maybe there's one way to listen that, if I listen that way, affinity, closeness with another person starts to happen. Maybe there's another way I listen, and if I listen that way in a conversation, people start to share new ideas, kind of brainstorm. And maybe there's another way to listen that produces action, that has people start to take action, and that it's a function of how I listen. But nobody's looking there. Nobody's. So if I wanted to have a breakthrough in communication, I would be looking under the hood, so to speak, of this everyday thing called speaking and this everyday thing called listening, to see what are the real possibilities in there. And if I keep this analogy to moving, there's a lot of ways to move. And having that variety of possibilities makes life richer and makes you more effective. Well, that's the same thing is true in communication. Mostly if you say to people, what are your different ways of speaking? They'll say louder and softer. And if they say listening, they'll say listening and not listening. Well, that's that's a pauper's supply of distinctions. And it is possible to develop real mastery in ways of listening and ways of speaking that produce different outcomes. We at Landmark offer two programs, two courses in communication, a foundational course called the Access Communication, the Access to Power, and an advanced communication course called Communication, the Power to Create. And these are both 2-day courses, weekends, with a follow-up midweek in an evening for about 3 hours. And people, thousands and thousands of people have found that there two things happen when they participate. One is their effectiveness skyrockets. They just situations they'd either given up on or were moving slowly just turn out, and they turn. I mean, when I say situations, I mean relationship kind of stuff, and also very practical projects they've been at work on. People get promotions in their career, establish new careers, that kind of thing. That's one part of it. But the other is, in a way, even more important, which is people's experience of satisfaction and peace of mind. The rarest two things in the universe, walking away from a conversation satisfied with the conversation you just had, and during the conversation, having a real calm and peace of mind and enjoyment, irrespective of the content, irrespective of whether it's an argument or whether it's an agreement or whatever the hell it is, that is available. And I think that's why people take these programs in such large numbers and get so much out of them. We live in a world where our natural state is anxious, and so we don't notice being anxious unless it gets so intensely anxious, then you notice it. You notice it when you're wired to the hilt, but the low-grade baseline anxiety people live with is almost unnoticeable. Now, if you ask, where is that? Is it in, is where can I want to get hold of it and get rid of it? You don't know what to do. People think it's in their head but the fact is that the way we listen either produces anxiety or the antithesis or the opposite. If it's quiet over where I am, and I'm in a noisy world. When I say noisy, I don't mean just literally noisy. I mean tense, threatening, all that stuff. But if it's calm over where I am, I can be quite effective in that world. If it's noisy over where I am and I'm in a world that's that way, it's not going to go so well. So my access, I think, to being at peace has to do with the way I listen. And if I can discover that the way I listen for most of us starts off with something's wrong, something I better be careful. I think people start in a conversation with I better be careful. They don't think the thought I better be careful. They come from I better be a little on guard. That something bad could happen. And you learn that as a young child. And then you listen that way the rest of your life. Now, it turns out if you actually spend some time at work on your own listening, you can actually quell that. You can complete that. You can put that to rest, and that isn't there for your life. And you're one of those few people who are in the storm, but there's no storm in you.
For more information on Landmark's courses, including the communication programs, go to landmarkworldwide.com.